makes the job of fighting trafficking that much harder. In 2004, about 8,000 prostitutes worked in Amsterdam alone, and some 2/3 of those were of foreign origin. In 2005, Dutch police received more than 600 reports of women who may have been forced into prostitution, and 400 women contacted anti-trafficking organizations for assistance. In 2007, there were 343 registered victims of sex trafficking. 25% of those were under 18 years old. At the time of our research in 2006 and 2007, there was reportedly no police presence between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the official red light district in Amsterdam, a time which one trafficking victim who suffered her experiences there called, quote, a black market of prostitution when children became readily available. Only 5 to 6 police officers worked in the entire red light district at that time. There was no capacity for investigating the illegal trafficking occurring. This was an iceberg with legal prostitution at the top, masking the vast illegal activity beneath. The Dutch Criminal Code in 2005 extended jurisdiction to reach citizens committing child sex tourism. That is sexual exploitation of a child outside the Netherlands. But in the Netherlands, there continued to be an increasing amount of pimping, organized crime, and exploitation of children. In a 2005 news report, a former vice officer in the red light district reported that the 2 primary groups of pimps working in that red light district were called, quote, lover boys and, quote, the Turks. He reported that law enforcement officers had 3 months to complete investigations, a wholly insufficient amount of time for these complicated crimes. Shared Hope's partner, Scarlet Cord, worked in the red light district in Amsterdam, doing outreach and services to trafficking victims. They identified the lover boy problem early on and began to put programs into schools to educate and to prevent the recruitment of these mostly teenage victims. The lover boy pimping method is very similar to modern trafficking in the US, relying on emotional bondage rather than physical force to maintain control over their young victims. In our research in the Netherlands, victims reported also that, quote, magic was used to entice them. But this is not limited to the Netherlands, and it's certainly not limited to any one country. A weak link in the global dragnet and safety net will prevent us from protecting the victims of child sex trafficking. As Congressman Smith noted at the start of this briefing, traffickers rely on the ability to frighten children and keep them quiet. And it's imperative that the justice system be ready now to listen to allegations and to thoroughly investigate them. Shared Hope has highlighted some promising practices through our research here in the United States in the last 5 years. Promising practices to develop proper responses to child sex trafficking. Some of these are happening in other countries already, and all of them are transferable to any country willing to take them on. First, the presence of school resource officers within schools to help build trust between law enforcement and children undermines the traffickers' ability to scare their victims into distrusting law enforcement. Education at all levels of the justice system, from investigation to trial, will lead to more identifications of child sex trafficking victimization and better responses. Above all, victim-centered approaches to interviewing and investigation are critical to a child's confidence to disclose their victimization. A few examples exist that are worthy of highlighting. The Dallas Police Department has a high-risk victims unit in which the process is to flag a file of a child who is a repeat runaway and direct that file straight to this high-risk victims unit where there are child forensic interviewers ready to investigate with proper child approaches. Gang units like the Fairfax County Gang Unit in Northern Virginia are being trained in sex trafficking identification and victim interviewing that can separate the victim from the influence and gag control of the gang. Human trafficking task forces across the U.S. and in other countries bring together service providers and law enforcement to ensure victims are supported and encouraged to seek justice. And lastly, victim witness coordinators in the majority of federal law enforcement offices across the country ensure the victim is supported through the investigation and trial process. Shared Hope International has developed the Protected Innocence Challenge, which, though domestic, has relevance for the world. It includes a framework of laws for effective responses to child sex trafficking. The framework credits those states that have laws in place providing for victim protections and support through the investigation and trial process. Currently, 34 states in the United States currently have some protection, and all are being encouraged to enact more laws, which will ensure that more victims are heard. And finally, as I stated several times throughout, attacking demand. Demand is the root of the problem, and we have heard about the exploitation today of children firsthand from the people representing them, and if we could focus some of that effort on demand, maybe this wouldn't have occurred in the first place. Resources and prioritization of fighting demand are critical and lead to corroboration of a victim's complaint, less reliance on victim testimony, and hopefully, and ultimately, a reduction in the number of children exploited. Child sex trafficking is a threat to our society's health, undoubtedly, and it's truly a national and international security threat as well. It allows organized crime to prey on the most vulnerable until we all, as a global community and individually within our nations, our state, our cities, get serious about stopping demand. This fight has no end. Thank you for continuing to keep this issue at the forefront.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the outstanding work that Shared Hope International has done and continues to do. You know, I noted in reading your, Mr. Cohen, do you have any questions? Okay, thank you so much. I noted in your report, you point out that the women in this area, talking about one of the red light districts, are mostly Latin and South American, from Colombia, Cuba, Brazil, and Venezuela. I was in Brasilia on a trip years ago to talk about an effort to get the Brazilians to pass a comprehensive strategy on combating sex trafficking, to protect their own children because child sex tourism is so huge there. I met with parliamentarians in Brasilia for several days, but we made a one-day trip to Rio de Janeiro and went to a shelter. And while I was at the shelter, there was a woman from Brazil who had just been rescued with tears pouring from her eyes, rescued a couple of days earlier, but as she told her story, she was en route to Amsterdam. And I have raised this issue myself with the Dutch as head of delegation for the United States Parliamentary Assembly, as chairman of this commission, and as you point out in your report, when you get 2/3 or more, some put it as high as 80% or higher, of the women being foreign, even the indigenous Dutch women, it is highly suspect as to at what level of coercion have they been brought there. But when so many people from other countries are present, it begs the question about the, and there have been the rapporteur's report in previous years that strongly suggest that there are levels, and I would suggest high degrees of levels of force, fraud, and coercion involved. And I saw it myself with the one rescued woman who was in a shelter in Rio de Janeiro, who was saved from that nightmare of being sent as a slave to Amsterdam. I would like to ask, if you could, Ms. Vardaman, you know, Ms. van der Plas, in her statement, in one of her two asks was that Holland be removed from Tier 1. Your thoughts on that?
Still on. I think that the assessment of tier placement is a complicated one, and I would defer. I would defer. What I would say, though, is that it is clear that efforts are in place in the Netherlands and in the United States and in other Tier 1 countries that do reflect an intention to address trafficking. Whether those efforts are reaching their goal, I think, is a different question.
Let me ask Mr. B if he could. You mentioned that you were not allowed to leave Amsterdam by your pimp. What would have happened had you left Amsterdam? Do you know of anybody who escaped, and what happened to them?
Can you say it
Yes.
again?
What would have happened had you been able to leave Amsterdam after your exploitation? Do you know of any others who did?
I would have been punished.
How? Beatings?
Sorry?
You would have been beaten, or?
Yeah, beaten or worse.
Do you know anybody who was maltreated, who tried to escape?
No, I can only speak for my own.
In your presentation, you stated that various high-ranking Dutch officials were part of a pedophile ring contained in Professor Van Roon's Rolodex, and that you made extensive reports to the police during the investigation. Were there any law enforcement officials suspected in the investigation or other officials that might have been in place to stop that investigation?
Yes.
Was your pimp or anyone else ever charged as part of that investigation?
I don't know.
You don't know, okay. Your presentation indicates that you were prostituted at the festival bar in Amsterdam along with other boys. Can you tell us what has happened to the festival bar after your police report? Was it shut down? And were the boys rescued?
The festival bar has changed the name, and there are still boys working.
Notwithstanding your complaint? What's the name now? Could you tell us what the name of it is now? Do you know?
No, I don't know the name, sorry.
You are obviously being, we are seeking to hide your identity to the greatest extent possible. Are you fearful of any retaliation because you have presented testimony here before the Helsinki Commission?
I don't know what happened with me if I go back to the Netherlands, if I arrive at the airport. I talked about it with my attorney.
Thank you, Mr. B. Ms. van der Plas, if I could ask you, in your presentation, you mentioned a previous case, of course, the Rolodex case, that you believe shows a pattern of investigations being shut down by Mr. Demek. You mentioned that, quote, according to the leading investigators in the case, as soon as Demek became a person of interest in this matter, the investigation was shut down, and that the sting operation to catch the man who identified Mr. B was compromised. This information came from leading investigators in the case, did it? And
yes.
How many investigators on the case were willing to speak with you about this?
One investigator visited my office and told me his whole story, and he told me this. He was in the preliminary investigation, and he knew very well that this Mr. Demek was one of the suspects. And he said we had some unofficial wiretapping, and we heard all the people speaking, but at the moment we started the official investigation, it was, all the communication was closed down. So it couldn't be different than there was a leak. And also he said, when we went to this middleman, this Mr. Van Roon, he was waiting for us. He was waiting for us, and his whole house was clean. So it was very clear. He told us, oh, there you are, we are waiting you. And he also told me that the victim who is now testifying to you gave him very reliable information at the time that he found back when he did his searches. And a question you asked the victim, I can tell you that in that case, one pimp was convicted, not very large sentence. One of it was conditional, and the condition was for a part of the prison sentence he could work in a kind of farm where children came. So the policeman who told me that was still so angry. The policemen who worked on that case are really frustrated. And I also heard, but that was through a middleman, a journalist, who told me that the chief of the investigation team, a man who really believed in God and in good life, he told the journalist, I can't speak. I go every Sunday to the church to sing it away from me. That's what policemen say. And I know that Mr. Langendoen next to me spoke even to other investigators who of that team at that time who confirmed exact that information, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the current State Secretary of Justice, Fred Teven, is that how you say it? Teven, stated under oath in 2007 that high-ranking Dutch officials in the Rolodex case were never prosecuted because the investigation was blocked. Was there an investigation as to Mr. Teven's allegation that the investigation was blocked, and if so, what was the outcome? Did anybody look into why it was blocked?
No, nobody ever looked in. It's also this case was kept silent. And it was very special that our State Secretary of Justice, Mr. Teven, brought that under oath in a complete different case. He said this was what happened. And what's also interesting that in 1999, Mr. Teven, when he was still intelligence prosecutor, he was prosecutor in that case, he gave an interview to a magazine for lawyers. And he said there, it's my knowledge as prosecutor of intelligence cases that it's known to me, the information I gathered, that criminal organizations in the Netherlands have influence on politicians and even on judges. So when you hear that, it's terrifying. He then was still prosecutor. But the problem is, since Mr. Teven is Secretary of State, we don't hear him anymore. So what happened, I asked Dan? Because this is what he said, and that's published. We even can show you if you would like. He said that then, that he has information, because when you see, when this happened in Turkey, that foreign intelligence agencies have influence, can blackmail our government, and that's terrifying. But not only them. When criminal organizations deliver kits to people in so high ranking inside the government and prosecution office and justice system, then those criminal organizations also have mean to blackmail those people. And that's going on for a long time when this already happened in the 90s. And even our State Secretary told that to a judge, told that in public, and nothing happened.
The situation with Mr. Babason, and maybe, Klaas, you might want to speak to this as well. All of us are well aware of the intensity of the feelings of Turks for Kurds and vice versa. Yeah. I'll never forget after the first Persian Gulf War when Kurds had made their way to the border. I went over there while it was still a very volatile situation and saw as these poor people were on the border being helped by our special forces and others to simply survive. Yes. There were the Turks barely allowed them to be across the border.
That was the.
And so my point is, you know, the backdrop of that issue and the quid pro quo, perhaps allegation that led to the blackmailing and the situation.
That's very clear because Mr. Demming was member of this EU CAF4 committee, right. And he was specially responsible for the Kurdish-Turkish conflict. So he had this direct connection with the Turks. And this Mr. Babasin, this Turkish activist, was busy to let the Kurds have a better life. And some of them who couldn't have that to run away from there. So in that way, they were kind of opponents. And that's why the Turkish government at the time said, we see this Babasin as a real main object. We want to silence him. And you have to help us because we caught you with those kids. And that's also what Mr. Langendoen heard in Turkey. But this whole political thing behind it is very clear. And then it's so strange that Mr. Demming said, I didn't visit Turkey since '87. He was the main person in the Netherlands with this, who was dealing with this Kurdish-Turkish conflict. And had
I think your point that an ambassador to another country would hardly stay in Washington. They would be traveling in and back and forth, would be staying there, of course. But in this case, when that's your duties, it would be a dereliction of those duties not to be traveling to Turkey. I think that was a very important internal strength to your argument. Yeah. Can you give any indication as to why the current Turkish leadership when these Turkish boys were so allegedly abused and exploited and raped, wouldn't find it in their own interest to protect a Turkish citizen, and not want to say whatever happened before, so be it. But not so be it. Whatever happened before, wherever that goes, we want to protect our own children and now young adults.
Yes, you could say so. But at that moment, the Turkish government, that was not the nowadays government, but was focusing on this Bible sin. They wanted to
that government, but this government, it seems to me, and the Turkish government now more and more has spoken out against combating human trafficking, and this is the case of their own kids.
And that's why they gave Mr. Langendoen so much information. So we all our sources are from Turkey, official sources, other sources, isn't it, Mr. That's why they want to help us, but they, in the same time, they are forced by diplomatic pressure not to give everything, just to give pieces. That's why we are hanging in between for so many years already. Yeah.
Now, the major daily that may very shortly, if you want to speak to that, Klaas?
No.
Okay. The major daily or the major newspaper, will this be a breakthrough in terms of finally bringing some light and scrutiny to the issue?
That will come, yes, because that is going to speak about, by the way, also investigations Mr. Langendoen did, and there are new Dutch victims who spoke about what happened to them. And that's coming very soon, huh? Isn't it? Yeah.
I'd just ask you, if I could, Ms. van der Plas, you talked about Mustafa. You mentioned that, because I have met with the ambassador of the Netherlands to the United States. I do believe in hearing from all sides and doing my due diligence. Matter of fact, he did mention in his letter the Tier 1 status, as if that somehow exonerated a country, and that would apply to any country. That may show a good trend, but if there are individual cases that need to be looked into, they need to be. But that said, that says nothing about this case. You talked about Mustafa. He did not feel safe in traveling to the Netherlands. You mentioned contra-actions, I think was the phrase you used.
Contra-actions was the Rolodex case.
Okay.
But the contra-actions...
with Mustafa, it was with safety. He wanted a guarantee of safety, and he also wanted a lawyer present.
Yes, that's what I wrote to the prosecutor. And then the
why wouldn't the lawyer be allowed to be present with someone who wants to come forward like that? That's
yes. When I asked the prosecutor, and I have it all in correspondence available, I said because of the threats the boy had, I would like to be present, or his Turkish lawyer, and we want security, and because he is giving a statement against the highest man at the Ministry of Justice, and for this kid, as a Turkish citizen, he knows those people have power. And then he wrote back, Mrs. van der Plas, dit is Nederland. That means this is the Netherlands. So, no. And I couldn't guarantee my client full safety when he came, so the kid was terrified, really scared to death. Yeah.
With regards to the Turkish prosecution office in Diyarbakir, you said they now have an active investigation against Mr. Demek, and two of the individuals worked with Turkey. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? How long has that been going on?
This is very recently started, somewhere this spring, because the Turkish authorities want something and then all the time delay, and that's why I'm waiting now with this appeal that I get the information from them. But I know that exactly last week they made some movement, and they're gonna listen to some witnesses. So there is now some progress in it, and I think when from United States side there is support for what they're going to do in this respect, that would help them really.
Let me ask you, have you been threatened? Have you personally been threatened yourself at all? No,
but I don't even see it when I'm not, how do you call it, available for that or open for that? Yeah.
Let me ask you one final question. You mentioned that a current member of the Turkish State Security Council, Mr. Salibi,
yes,
of the military wing of the Turkish intelligence service, sent to the Netherlands a list of the many visits he believed Mr. Demek made to Turkey between 1995 and 2003. However, the Netherlands has dismissed the report, never contacted the author, who remains a special security advisor for, among other things, the Turkish Minister of the Interior. Could you speak further on that? Why would such information be shelved or refused to be acted upon, or is it being acted upon in any way? And did this Mr. Salibi run a risk in providing that information himself?
Mr. Salibi made this report.
Because again, in my conversations with the Dutch, they say that he just wasn't there, and that exonerates him. And as you have pointed out, and others have pointed out, he came under aliases. He came other ways.
I made some attachments for your commission. His EC report is in there, and page 23 gives the dates. That he was the first one to reveal the dates that Demming entered Turkey in the 90s, and how everything happened. But I also attached his letter to the Dutch authorities, this independent commission Mr. Langendoen spoke about, and he offered in that, he said who he was, and he offered to give all the information. But nobody ever asked him to do so and to give it. So what we gave, it was ignored. And we give that to you. So what he said, and I was visiting Mr. Salibi even with Mr. Langendoen, and we discussed his report. We have photos of that. Yeah. And we have also, he gave us also a photo showing, look, I write this letter that I was a special advisor of the Minister of Interior in Turkey at that time, but here, look me on the airport with this actually second person in the AK party. So this is really someone not to ignore, but the Dutch just didn't even think about it. When I would have been Ministry of Justice in the Netherlands, I'm not, I should have said, okay, the first thing I do is transparently, openly ask the Turkish government what is about this report. They never did, just ignored.
Is it a cover-up? Is it a cover-up?
What a cover-up? You mean that they don't do anything?
Right.
What we see all the time in this case, whatever we bring in fact, silence is after that. We are ignored.
Mr. Langendoen, let me ask you a question. You indicate that after years in the criminal justice system in the Netherlands, you were very surprised by the facts presented to you by Ms. van der Plas and her legal unit regarding the conviction of Babasan and its relationship to the allegations against a high-ranking justice official. You said, and I quote, "At the start of your independent research, you wondered if the theory of the law firm was not a nonsense fairy tale story, and you assumed that this level of corruption could never occur in your country, where you had worked so hard against organized crime," close quote. Is it your assessment that this case is an aberration from what is normal in the Netherlands, or is it a sign of a systemic problem with organized crime?
I was shocked.
Put on your, sorry.
I was shocked about what I heard from those two lawyers when they asked me to do some investigation about that. I said it's a fairy tale. I know Holland very well about organized crime, all that kind of thing. Those things doesn't happen in Holland. That was my opinion at that moment. But they asked me, Klaas, please do the investigation. But we believe in the story. And after that, I must say, I think it's true. That the Dutch government are blackmailed in the story of the highest-ranking man of justice.
You mentioned that the National Investigations Unit did only a facts collection investigation, but had no authority to do a proper investigation. What additional options and powers would have been open to an investigator if they had been empowered to open an official investigation, just so we understand the differences? Which witnesses did they not interview as a result of the limited investigation?
I asked the head of that investigation. I give him all the information. I said, I can give you the people who must do this investigation. I traveled them to Turkey. I've got very good contacts during these days in intelligence service, police, everything. I can introduce him. You can do a very good investigation. He said, no, we do nothing.
Why do you think that's the case?
He said we don't see anything for no facts for a criminal investigation. And then we